Well, we've been working on a new series, just really restarted it again. It's, in a sense, it's part 2 or season 2 of this great story about David, who was a better king than Saul. And so, of course, we've called it A Better King, and that's David. But there's another level, isn't there, really? There's a better king even than David, the great king, King Jesus. So we're just getting into this series again. Last week, we looked at the death of Saul, the last king, and his son Jonathan. And we learned the shock as David heard of this from that messenger. Now we're looking at how he grieves for them. And what's interesting about this passage is that it gives us an insight into David. We get a look into his tender side. David was a warrior. There were times when David, and we'll see that as the story opens over the weeks, when he was quick-tempered, when he was courageous, when he was foolish. Here we see the tender heart of David as he writes this lamentation. Remember, of course, he was a poet as well as a warrior and a king, or would-be king. And he weeps over Jonathan and Saul. It's one of the great things about working through a passage of Scripture, a book like this, is that we come to passages that we probably wouldn't normally go to as a one-off. And this has a lot to tell us about grief and about lamentations and mourning, particularly over the loss of loved ones. And it's something that's real to all of us. I don't suppose there's anyone here that hasn't been touched in some way or other by the loss of a loved one. Could be parents, grandparents, could be children, brothers, sisters, work colleagues, close friends. We know the pain that brings. And it's good to come to passages where we deal with this, because the Bible is very real, isn't it? It doesn't gloss over the difficult times of life. And here we have a chapter really devoted to grief. It has other things to say, of course. And it's David's grief. And he's mourning over two that he loved. Now, we might find that strange that he loved Saul. We'll come to that in a little while. But he is grieving. Death is always evil. It's always an enemy. It's our last enemy. And when loved ones are gone, it's right to mourn. It's normal. It's expected. God's given us the ability to shed tears and to grieve, and we should never be ashamed of that. True, we don't grieve as those without hope, but we still grieve. There are some Christians who think you shouldn't grieve at all. Well, Jesus grieved. Many great godly saints wept over the loss. Look at David here as a great example. But we do it in different ways. It has different effects on us depending on the closeness to the person, depending on our personality type. The circumstances can change and vary. But it's good to grieve. And there are times when we need to be willing to comfort those who are grieving and to be sympathetic, because we know when it happens to us how hard it is. Yes, life does have to go on, and there are times when we have to deal with that. But grief is a process that we should experience and shouldn't be ashamed of. David wasn't. Here we see him grieving. What's really astonishing about this, though, is his grief for his enemy. And maybe that's something for us to learn. Are we not told to love our enemies, to grieve for them? Well, David did. So let's look at this. What we're going to do is go through the passage briefly and then try and draw out some lessons from it. So let's look first at those few verses in verse 17. David took up this lament concerning Saul and his son, Jonathan, and he ordered that the people of Judah be taught this lament of the bow. It is written in the book of Jasher. David laments for both Saul and Jonathan. And what is a lament? Well, we have lots of them in the Bible. It is basically an outpouring of grief over the loss of a loved one, usually a death, not always. It could be lamenting over sin or failure, or regret of some kind. There are many examples of these. We have them, certainly many in the Psalms. David himself wrote psalms that were akin to a lamentation, a sorrow. Certainly we get them in the book of Job, and we get quite a few from Jeremiah. There's even a book called The Lamentations, which I'm sure you know all about. It's one of those books that we rarely go to, isn't it? So the Bible has a lot to say about grieving and expressing grief. There is no shame here. Maybe that's a problem we have more in the Western world. And here we have David. He pens this lamentation. And he wants it to be written down, to be remembered. We have this curious book called the Book of Jasher. It's mentioned also in Joshua when he calls the sun to stand still, and it's to be recorded in the Book of Jasher. That book is not in the Bible, but it doesn't mean to say it didn't exist. It was some kind of record that was kept for special occasions, records of the Israelite history. And here David is saying that he wants it to be remembered. Isn't this remarkable? He's talking partly about this King Saul, who was a disgrace and a failure. But David, in his goodness, wants the name to be remembered. The lament of the bow, there are lots of reasons why it could be called that. We don't know precisely. Probably the most likely is that it may well be the name of the tune. But Jonathan was known as the man of the bow. In fact, it's mentioned there in that passage a little bit further down, isn't it, where it talks about Jonathan. And where is it? He says, Saul and Jonathan in life, where are we? There's something about the bow, and we'll come to it in a moment. So it may have been the reason why it was called the bow. Of course, his particular affection was for Jonathan, his brother. David cannot avoid lamenting the death of Saul and Jonathan. He loved them both. Jonathan, you can understand, can't you? But David? Jonathan was like a brother to him. But lamenting over the death of Saul is much harder to grasp, isn't it? And we'll look at that in just a moment as he opens up this public grief for these two. So, he laments for Saul and Jonathan. The theme really is how the mighty have fallen. We get that refrain 3 times here, once at the beginning, twice towards the end. And he starts by stating something which might seem a bit strange. A gazelle lies slain on your heights, Israel. How have the mighty fallen? It's actually unusual that the word gazelle, of course a gazelle was a kind of deer. It's unusual that gazelle is being used because in most translations it's not used. It seems to be only the NIV that does this. In fact, I did a little search on it because the word is so difficult to translate that there's all sorts of variations. I consulted 56 Bible translations and only 5 used the word gazelle, and 3 of those were variations of the NIV. 8 versions instead used the word splendor. 19 versions used glory. 20 used beauty. 2 versions used pride and joy. Yes, I know that doesn't add up to 56, but the other ones that I've not mentioned omitted the term or were a combination of some of the others. So, if we pull it together, this word here in the Hebrew speaks of glory, beauty, splendor, something quite wonderful, hard to express. And that's what he's saying. When these two died, something of glory and splendor of Israel went. This is why David has this depth of sorrow. And he wants people to know this. Can you imagine the pathos in David's voice as he cries this out? He is in deep mourning for the loss of these two men, the loss of two mighty leaders. We move on. He says, tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines be glad, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised rejoice. Now, the lament is a kind of a poem, and so there's lots of poetical terms and structures. And here he's really saying, in effect, don't let the Philistines, the enemies, know. Well, of course, the Philistines historically did know. They were the ones that killed them. They obviously knew. But in this language, what he's trying to get across is it's so shameful that these two men have gone, the leaders of Israel. Don't let it be known, because our enemies will rejoice. The Philistines, of course, were their sworn enemies, and they shouldn't know. And then there's this idea of the daughters going out and rejoicing over the loss. Maybe that takes David back to the time when he had his victories. And do you remember the maidens would go out with their tambourines singing praises, and there was that refrain, Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. It would seem it was the part of the culture that the women would take up the song and rejoice at times of victory. And he says, don't let them know about it. Such is our shame. Then he turns to the mountains, the very place where Saul and Jonathan were slain. What does he say there? Mountains of Gilboa, may you have neither dew nor rain. May no showers fall on your terrace fields. For there the shield of the mighty was despised. The shield of Saul no longer rubbed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the flesh of the mighty. The bow of Jonathan, that's probably why it was called the Song of the Bow, did not turn back. The sword of Saul did not return unsatisfied. What's he saying here? Well, again, it's in the form of poetry, and this was often what would happen in Old Testament poetry. A place or a land where there had been some disgrace would be cursed. Of course, it wasn't going to make any literal difference to the land, but it was the way of expressing mourning and grief. Mount Gilboa is going to be cursed because it was the place where they died. It was the scene of death. May it have no dew, no rain or showers. Even the very weapons seem to be cursed, the shield and the bow that failed them. As I say, it's a common feature of the poetry to try and convey the absolute extremity of David's grief. And it becomes all the more remarkable when we think that one of them that he's grieving for is Saul. We can understand it, as I say, with David. And then he goes on to come to the two particular people involved, Saul and Jonathan. In life they were loved and admired, and in death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. Daughters of Israel, weep for Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and finery, who adorned your garments with ornaments of gold. David now focuses on the two fallen heroes, the glory of Israel. He dwells on their greatness, both of them. They were both loved and admired. There's no hint here of Saul's misdemeanors. Not at this moment. David mourns their death. And he says, in death, it couldn't part them. Which is remarkable when we think that life was not easy with father and son because of David. We know that from the history, Jonathan was very fond of David and loyal to him, and was no doubt irritated with his father. Of course, he respected him, but there were those squabbles. There was that one when David had to flee, and Saul virtually wanted to kill his own son. There was another occasion when a ban had been made about not eating And Jonathan didn't know about it, you remember? And he took some honey from the wood. And Saul was prepared to kill him. There wasn't a lot of love between them. But here David seems to overlook that. Such is his grief. He wants to remember the good, the positive. It's not that he's ignoring it or dismissing it entirely, but it seems like he wants to remember what good Saul did. And he did do some good in his early life, and leave God to do the judging of Saul, as we'll see a little bit later. But look what he says about Saul instead. He describes him as being swifter than an eagle, stronger than a lion. He's praising him. And then he talks about how he clothed the daughters of Jerusalem that should now be weeping. He gave them scarlet and finery, ornaments of gold. Isn't it amazing how generous David is to Saul? Because here he's not writing as an historian and recording all the details and the facts and all the sordid details of Saul's life. He's grieving, and he is remembering the good that Saul was able to do before he fell from grace and lost his way. How generous and forgiving is David, even to his very enemy. And he goes on, how the mighty have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies slain on your heights. Then the focus is on Jonathan. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. How the mighty have fallen. The weapons of war have perished. He repeats that refrain, only now adds some more detail, particularly about Jonathan. He grieves like one who has lost a close brother. There's this comparison of love between he had for Jonathan and that of women. And some people have tried to draw an inference from this that there was some homosexual element here, which can easily be disproved. It's quite nonsense if you know anything about David, that he was very much a man who had sexual troubles more with women. He had that incident, which we'll come to in chapters ahead, with Bathsheba, where he committed adultery. He was married. He'd had 2 wives. It's sad, isn't it, that we project back from our sordid 21st century ideas that were not here, that were innocent. It's also sad that we feel the need to, or some people, to make those kind of comments. What David was saying here is that he truly loved Jonathan. They were like brothers. They cared for each other. They had mutual respect. The implications that we've had, and they are very real from some commentators, only goes to show what confused and sordid culture we live in now. So there is this amazing lamentation that David writes with tears and wants recorded and remembered. Such is his love. Well, we're going to look now briefly at that love for each of these men in turn. David's love for Saul and David's love for Jonathan. Let's look at his love for Saul. It was genuine. This is not a put-on, a kind of celebrity tribute. Now, I'm not saying all celebrities are hollow and shallow like that, but you know what I mean. Sometimes you hear it in politics, perhaps. They're cutting each other, and then someone dies, and they all come out with these wonderful tributes, and then a few weeks later, they get back to normal. This is genuine. This is real. He's not just saying words. He's not being a hypocrite here. He really does mourn over Saul. Now, humanly speaking, we would expect him to despise Paul, to be relieved that he's gone. Saul was a thorn in David's side, and he's gone. Shouldn't David have been rejoicing? And yet he didn't despise him, did he? But think what Saul had done to him. The jealousy, the betrayal, the attempt to kill him on several occasions, the hunting him down. He made David's life a misery. If ever there was an enemy, it was Saul. If ever we could say that someone had a right to despise another man, we might say David had that right. But he loved Saul. How do we explain this? Now, it's not that David wasn't aware of Saul's being rejected by God. It's not that he was overlooking Saul's faults when he sinned and he disobeyed God. But David had such a generous heart that he still loved Saul. He still mourned the fact. That's why he could never lay hands on him when he was alive. He was the Lord's anointed one. And this reflects well on David, because through it, even though Saul had failed, he saw the office of the king there, and he honoured Saul on that account. I think there was a genuine love for Saul in spite of what he did. Oh, how David embodies that call to love our enemies. I think this brings David in a really strong and good light. Saul had done so many things to hurt David. David responds in this way. Maybe there's a challenge there for us. He wasn't condoning Saul. There was genuine grief for Saul's failure. And David knew that ultimately God would deal with Saul. But it is a challenge to us, isn't it? The real challenge here is, can we forgive others when we've been wronged? David could. And my goodness, didn't he have grounds for not forgiving? Most of his life had been ruined by this man. His life had been threatened. But he held no grudges in that sense. I wonder how it is with us. Do we have someone that we can't forgive? It's important that we make our peace, maybe to even be the first to make reconciliation if that is necessary. An extraordinary love for a man who gave nothing but trouble to David. How he loved him. But what about David's love for Jonathan? It was a special bond of friendship between two men of God. And why should this be so strange? Perhaps sadly it's because we don't see much of that here in this world, especially among men. We're doing a lot in this church to try and promote male friendships and to seek to get men engaged in talking to one another and sharing with one another. It doesn't seem to be a problem so much with the ladies. You seem to be much better at naturally making friends. Men are a bit more awkward about it. And here is a great example of two men who truly cared for each other, respected each other, looked out for each other, supported each other. What a wonderful picture it is for us Christian men to aspire to. And both, there was a cost to it, wasn't there? Think of Jonathan. You know, we can forget that he was the prince. He was the heir to the throne. When Saul was finished, when he died, Jonathan could have been the new king. And right from early days, he knew it wasn't going to be that way, that David was going to take the place. Wouldn't that be grounds for Jonathan to be jealous of David? And yet he wasn't. God had worked in that man's life. He was such a gracious character. I don't think we know enough about Jonathan. I don't think we thank God enough for men like him. He was the prince. He was the heir to the throne. But he gave it up. He supported David. He protected him. He looked out for him. He tried to get his father to change his mind. What a friend to have. Who wouldn't want a friend like that? And David too responded and loved this man, Jonathan. And we find out later, there's a lovely passage in later on in 2 Samuel chapter 9, where David is now king. And remember, the house of Saul, of which Jonathan was part, was cursed. It was under judgment. All the relatives were to be dealt with. There was war between the two. We'll see that in the chapters that unfold. But there's a point where David has become king, and he asks the question, is there anyone in the house of Saul still alive, someone I can care for? And it happens to be that the son of Jonathan, Mephibosheth, is a cripple. And David has compassion on him for the sake of Jonathan. What lovely friendship. And he invites this outcast, this seeming enemy from the other family. And Mephibosheth is brought to the king's table and eats with David. What a beautiful picture of friendship from Jonathan and David. And again, it's a challenge for us, isn't it? But something else here, isn't there? We've seen how David loved these two men in different ways, perhaps. But the whole point is, the refrain here is the mighty fall. And I think this tells us something about our own frailty. The mighty do fall. I know it's a somber reminder, but we won't always be in this world. There is a day of reckoning for all of us. A day when we will stand before God. David has, Jonathan has, and all the greats down through history have. The mighty do fall. And we might see the mighty today in different ways. It could be those who have wealth, power, fame, status, the movers of this world. But all these things will fail. Doesn't matter who they are, whether they're a celebrity or a multimillionaire, one of the powerful people, they will all, one by one, go. They will die. Death is the great leveler. And that's what we see here. A king and a prince, the mighty, meet their death. It's interesting, isn't it, that Jonathan and Saul, very different characters, but they both died in the same place, under the same situation, on the same mountain. The only thing that was different in their death was their destinies. Saul and Jonathan, same day, different destinies. Now it seems evident from the life of Saul, from what we can gather in the scriptures, that he never repented, and is therefore now under God's judgment in hell, all through the centuries, and will be there forever. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? There is no escape. Jonathan, from what we can know about his life, he was gracious, he was faithful to David, he served God, he accepted that he wasn't going to be the next king. He trusted. And there's every belief that he is now in heaven in the presence of the living God. And of course, there has been that great reunion between David and Jonathan already, as there will be many, many reunions in heaven. Two men, the same family, of the same blood, died on the same day, different destinations. It's a stark reminder that we all die, and also that the mighty, doesn't matter who they are, you can't buy an insurance that prevents death. People claim they do, of course, but there isn't. God says, after death, we all face judgment. If we know Christ, we have nothing to fear. If we don't know Christ, we have everything to fear. We all have this allotted lifespan, don't we? In this world, just this one life and no more. These two men, as I say, had their lives, and then they had their death. It's a monumental reminder of the two ways. Jonathan and Saul represent those two destinies that each one of us will face. Which one do you follow? Maybe somebody listening online. Which one are you closest to, Jonathan or Saul? In Matthew chapter 7, Jesus teaches and warns about hypocrisy in our lives. He talks about the need to seek and ask and knock. He talks about a narrow way and a broad way, of false teachers and false disciples. And finally, he comes with that call to take his words seriously, which ironically most of us take in with a children's song, the wise man and the foolish man. We may smile as we sing it, but really the teaching behind it is most deadly serious. Let me just remind you what it says, a little picture that God gives us. Jesus says this, therefore everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on a rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house. Yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like the foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down and the streams rose and the winds blew and beat against the house. And of course it fell with a mighty crash. And what Jesus is saying in that chapter, he's telling the people, there's this way or that way. There's the broad road or the narrow road. There's the false teaching or the true teaching. There's the seeking or the not seeking. And then he sums it up. Which one are you? If you're the one that's seeking, if you're the one that's on the narrow road, if you're the one that's trying to do that way, then you're like a wise man because you've got your life built on a rock. And that rock, of course, is Jesus. But if you're listening to it and you're not paying attention, you're not being wise, it's like building on sand. Who would build on sand? I don't know much about building, but I know that much. It wouldn't be a wise decision at all. And yet people in their life are building on sand, on a substance that will shift and turn and not hold you up, instead of on Christ. So it's a challenge to us all. I would say to remember that we are going to die, that we will face these things, all of us. Do you know Christ? And for those of you who do, how are you building your life now? What sort of way are you shaping it? How are you going to go forward? Like as you get older, it just goes away so quickly, doesn't it? It spins away. There's the old adage about when you're a child, time seems to crawl along. Do you remember those holidays? They seem to be so endless. And as you get into middle age, life seems to spin a little bit faster. And when you get into older age, well, the Christmases are piling up before you've seen one out. Easter's come, summer's come and gone, and Christmas is round again. And it seems to be going faster and faster. Of course, it's not, but our perception is as we're getting older. And time is running out. So let's make sure that we know Christ. And if we know Christ, that we're serving him faithfully. For even the mighty will one day fall. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this passage that reminds us of grief and the reality of mourning over loved ones. And also how quickly life takes away. We do pray for those who are struggling and mourning and grieving. Oh Lord, be close to them and give them peace. We pray for any who don't know you, that you will help them to see the reality that life will one day be gone, and that they might put their trust completely in Jesus. In his name, amen.